Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, here I'm at home, but supposedly I would be at FEP, which is a house where I have many friends. So I always like to cooperate with you. So basically, the idea for this seminar is to talk a little bit about benchmarking organizations, particularly with the application of the data development analysis technique, which is the technique that I have been used over the last years. I decided to do this more as an overview of what were the main applications that I did in the past, the lessons that were learned in these applications, and also talk a little bit about DEA. And I will specifically show you some results on what can be learned from these benchmarking exercises. So the outline, I will start by trying to address why are we studying efficiency and productivity issues? This is a question that nowadays I make myself more often than before, maybe because I'm aging. And when we age, I think we start trying to find the meaning of things in a sense. So what? I mean, I was studying efficiency and productivity analysis, and what for? So I tried to not to answer that question, but at least to address why it is important to analyze these issues. And then I will go to the lessons learned and also the main concepts regarding particularly DEA, which is the technique that I've been mostly applying, and some applications and also results from these applications. Regarding these questions, so what? Why should we study benchmarking and productivity and efficiency, which are related, as we will see afterwards? Well, one reason can be because the spending in public services, not only public services, but private too, but I mean, I've been studying a lot public services. So studying benchmarking and productivity analysis in public services is of interest, mainly because most expenses are actually growing over time. This graph shows the expenses for Portugal, where we actually see a growth up to, well, this suddenly become bigger. We see a growth up to 2011, 2012. Let me just see if I can find my pointer. The way to, no. I can't. Never mind. I have it here. Okay. So basically until 2011, it increased a lot, but it's still increasing. The main public expense is on social security. The second one is on health. The third one is on education. So I have studied a lot health and education. And in fact, the spending has grown a lot. This is not per capita, but if we see the graph per capita, actually the graph is very similar. So even per capita, this is not an effect of the increased population. Even per capita, the numbers are growing. So we are spending more in these kind of public services. Part of this growth is due to technological advancements, but also a part may be due to increased inefficiency. So in fact, it's important to analyze this. I think I did something here that is not moving my slides. Okay. We can also assess country productivity, for example, measured by the GDP per hour worked. And we see that in Portugal, in fact, we really need to pay attention to efficiency, productivity, and so on. Because we see countries here like Romania, which is this blue line, which has shown a remarkable increase in productivity as measured by the GDP per hour worked. The OECD average is this black line. We see this purple line here, which is Ireland, which has also shown a spectacular increase in this GDP per hour worked. Portugal has been mostly stable over time. We are not amongst the better countries. Actually, we were in a certain period, like in 2012, after the crisis for some reason. but we are now lagging much behind a lot of countries. Of course, there is also an interesting topic around this productivity when we talk about, in general, in these macroeconomic terms, which is the relationship between productivity and life satisfaction. As I told you, we start aging, we start asking about what for, why are we doing this? And we also start worrying a little bit more about life satisfaction. So in fact, these two concepts, this productivity and life satisfaction, are actually very much related. When we measure life satisfaction through OECD as an index, which is called the Better Life Index, which is an aggregate of various dimensions of life that people respond to some questionnaires and they produce this index. And there is a particular topic on life satisfaction. And when we see the relationship between life satisfaction and the GDP per hour worked, actually it's remarkable the positive relationship that exists between the two variables. It is also remarkable the place that Portugal takes on this slide here, because Portugal is this dot here. I think you are seeing my pointer, are you? Paula, maybe you can answer me.
Yes.
Okay. So basically, Portugal is around here. The most productive and the countries that showed higher life satisfaction are actually Norway, Denmark, Finland. Ireland is also good here, but more in terms of GDP. And so this is really interesting because the two concepts are actually related. And there are studies actually on these things that suggest life satisfaction impacts productivity, for example, in this article by Di Maria et al. And then there are also studies at a more individual level, not at country level. So, but this basically to tell you that, okay, it makes sense to study efficiency and productivity analysis. What I showed here is more at a macro level, which is not what I've been doing. I've been doing efficiency analysis more at a micro level, but of course, doing that at a micro level can contribute to increase the efficiency at the macro level and probably to better life satisfaction, which is, of course, a good thing. So, this just to tell you why should we be worried with these sort of things. Regarding the lessons learned, what I can tell to you is I've been following a kind of practice-driven research over these last years where I applied efficiency measurement techniques to a variety of settings. I applied it to banking during my PhD, to water companies, to retail outlets, to courts, to general practice units, to client countries for Portuguese shoes. This is a recent application, it's not published yet. To broiler production in Brazil, which is also very recent, and also education and health, which I'm going to show next with some more detail. What I would like to point out here is that in all these cases, what I was doing is doing some benchmarking, comparing countries, doing some benchmarking exercise for bankings, for water companies, and so on. The problem is that most of these exercises, what happens is that they are done on a research-based perspective. They are done with the cooperation of the companies, but then they are a one-time exercise. They don't implement this systematically in their day-to-day activities and in their decision-making process. And I think this is a pity because I think companies could gain a lot from including these sort of benchmarking exercises in their day-to-day decision-making processes. So in banking, for example, well, we did achieve some very interesting results, but then the bank didn't apply or didn't, I mean, they liked the results, but then they didn't apply the methodology or the procedure for doing this systematic benchmarking. In retail, I did retail actually twice. It was, or I did it for various types. For a big supermarket. I did it twice with Anna, which is here, and also with a student of mine that was actually a worker in this supermarket retail company. And then I also did it Parfora stores. They actually, we arrive at very interesting results, but then the results, I mean, are a one-time thing. Okay, we don't repeat the exercise further on. Nobody in the company gets it internally to start applying these tools on a systematic basis. However, this actually shows and has a lot of potential in terms of improvement, as you will see. So I think it could be interesting to get this in more systematic exercises. Regarding the health and education, what we did, and these are two projects that I'm going to refer to, which I did with Ana Camanho from FEOP. We actually developed some time ago a benchmarking website for schools, and then later on we decided to do that for hospitals as well. This website was actually a very interesting thing. At the time it was actually, I think it was the first benchmarking website for schools in Portugal. We were in close contact with some schools that actually applied this website. They used it for their internal evaluation because we developed a set of KPIs, and using these KPIs, the schools could compare themselves. Of course, we have public data here. The public data comes from ANS and the NEB. So basically, this benchmarking was mainly based on national exam scores of students, which we aggregated at the school level. And then we also computed aggregate efficiency score or performance score for schools, taking into account various KPIs. We did mostly the same for hospitals, where we developed a benchmarking website. We also had some public available data. We were in close contact with the Ministry of Health in this case and with the Ministry of Education in the other case. And so actually we developed these websites. They really liked what we did, but then actually they did not use it afterwards. In fact, what they did was they developed their own websites. Both of them, I mean, both the Education Ministry and the ACSS, which is a branch of the Health Ministry, they developed their own benchmarking websites for comparing hospitals and for comparing schools. And they, although we were in contact for some use of our websites, this didn't really happen. So in fact, these websites are nowadays, they are not available in the anymore. They were available for some time, but it's basically they were not. I mean, the website was interrupted. We have very interesting things in these websites. This is just an idea. We developed very interesting graphs, for example, to show we were basing when we were assessing KPIs, we were based a lot the analysis in terms of of percentile. Okay, so basically what we did was when we do a benchmarking, and this is one of the main aspects of benchmarking, what we do is we show where each hospital or where each school is, and we also show where all the other ones are. In these graphs, it was really interesting because, I mean, this is an indicator for the case mix of the hospital, but you show where the hospital is, in particular, the percentile where the hospital is, and each of these bars shows a different hospital. These are graphs that we developed internally ourselves. So this was fun. These projects were really fun. We developed some very interesting things. For the schools, we also had these KPIs. In this particular case, it was the grades of students in the various exams, where we have the internal grades and the exam grades, and we could actually put them together in the same graph and see how the internal grades compared with the external grades, and we could get very interesting radar graphs with some schools clearly being over-evaluating school students in terms of the internal grades, and other schools showing the opposite behavior. So this comparison was really interesting, and it provided interesting insights for the schools. What all these applications and these kind of things that I did, what it taught me, in a sense, was that, and this is a pity, I think that these studies are typically run once and by academics or others, but they do not have a decision-making power. And so what happens is that academics may indeed contribute towards improvement in many fields, but the implementation of these developments is not an easy thing, especially if we want it to be used in a systematic way and as a decision-making supporting tool. This is, of course, is more true. I mean, I think this can apply to various fields of research. In this benchmarking field, I think this is particularly true, and I've been facing that over the time, because in fact, benchmarking is supposed to be a continuous process. And what we do is usually we do it once, and it's very difficult to implement it to actually be converted into a continuous process and into a decision-making support tool. The public entities with which we worked, they actually prefer to resort to consultant companies than to universities to get the things done. That was the truth. In fact, we actually started the process of creating these websites, but then in the end, consultant companies were hired to do what was already done. So basically, I think that public services in Portugal are increasingly making use of these benchmarking tools. They are publicly available, and I think this is a remarkable progress that was done in this benchmarking of public services. But I mean, the tools used were developed by the ministry, and they didn't. I mean, although we probably had some contribution in the foundations of these sort of tools, but well, this is being optimistic. We cannot assume, and this I think is important, we cannot assume that the common person will understand our research outputs. I had close contact with schools because I was also involved in a program for evaluating schools in Catholic University, which is the AVS program. And by that program, we computed the value added of schools. I made a report, and then we visit schools to actually explain the results that were obtained. And it was interesting to realize that even when my audience were school teachers, it's not so easy to make them understand graphs like this one, for example. Okay, these kind of graphs are not, which for us, they were completely intuitive. We looked there and we immediately saw what was there. For them, it was not as intuitive as that. So we saw that the schools were ordered by ascending order, that this is the percentile where the school is in terms of this indicator, which is the national exams score, and this is the percentile where the school is in terms of the internal grades. So the school sees where it is located in terms of this distribution. I mean, for us, this is a kind of obvious concept, but it's not obvious for everybody. So I think one rule that we should all try to do is to try to keep it simple. In fact, it's very important that when we communicate our results, the results are communicated in a simple way. Genius, as Einstein said, is making complex ideas simple, not making simple ideas complex. And sometimes in research, we see a lot of these people that complexify things. So regarding, I wish I have time for everything, but I already see that I need to speed up. Regarding the main concepts that we have here, what I've been using mostly is DEA. And DEA's name is data development analysis. It is a frontier technique that uses the notion of dominance to define these benchmarks. So basically, we are doing benchmarking. We are in these websites. We basically did benchmarking in two ways. In a sense, we use KPIs, separate KPIs, and then we use an aggregate indicator of a selected number of these KPIs. The way or the logic behind this notion of frontier is relatively simple. If we see this graph, in this graph I have two KPIs. Imagine that the KPIs is the number of workers per sales volume and the capital, a measure of capital per sales volume as well. So basically, since both of these variables like capital and labor are divided by sales, I can say that each of these dots like sells €1 of product, for example. So basically, I can ask a simple question is which one is the best firm? When I am doing benchmarking, what I'm doing basically is doing comparisons. So which one is the best? So when we ask which one is the best, we say, okay, A is the best in terms of this KPI labor divided by sales because it's the one that uses the lower amount of labor. Now, but C and D, in fact, they are the best in terms of capital because actually they use the lowest amount of capital per sales. And since all of these dots, they are producing €1 or $1 or whatever of sales, so they are all comparable. So basically what would happen is that I would have an ideal best firm, and this ideal best firm is the one that shows the minimum value of each of these indicators. What happens in practice is that this ideal in general does not exist, okay? So if this ideal does not exist, what I have is several candidates of good performance. And these candidates of best performance, in a sense, are the units that dominate the others. So we have this notion of dominance to construct the frontier. It's actually a convex dominance because we consider that convex combinations between the points, if they dominate another point, they are also at the frontier. So basically, we construct the frontier by saying, okay, I know that point F dominates point H. Why? Because F shows lower values of both of these KPIs, okay, in both of them. A does not dominate F because A has a lower value of this KPI labor divided by sales, but a higher value of capital divided by sales. So these A, F, E, D, and C are basically the non-dominated points that I can find, and I put them at the frontier. So basically, with this notion, when we construct the frontier, then what we have is we can compute a distance to the frontier. And this distance to the frontier is a kind of, this distance can be seen as an aggregator function. It's a way of aggregating the two KPIs. Okay, I can aggregate them in a single score, which is the distance. Because when I compute the distance, for example, I can compute the distance for this unit B, but I can also compute the distance for this unit H. And I would say that the distance for this unit H is lower than the distance for this unit F, B, which basically tells me that H is a better performer than B. It's closer to the frontier. So it's closer to the frontier, it's the best performer in terms of these two indicators. So this distance is actually an aggregating functions mathematically, if you want. But it's also, this distance can also be interpreted as a measure of technical efficiency. So there are two fields of research that analyze these benchmarking and efficiency issues. We have the economic field and we also have the operations research field. In one case we are, and actually the origins of the DEA, they are actually a mix of these two fields, as I will show you afterwards. So continuing with this notion of the frontier, when we can ask if all the units at the frontier are equally good. When we are under the notion of technical efficiency, the answer is yes. I mean, I have no reason to prefer A over F or over D because they are all technical efficient. They are all non-dominated points. So I would say they are all equally good. However, if I have different pricing for capital and labor, that is not indifferent for a firm to be capital intensive or labor intensive. That is, if I value capital and labor differently, A may be preferred to D or D may be preferred to D, depending on the price levels of these two factors of production in a sense. So actually, if we add a value function to this graph, this is the same graph. Let's assume that I have a value function that say that labor is half price to capital. So the value function would be something like this. And under this value function, I would actually say that D is preferred to all the other options at the frontier because it's actually the one that shows the minimum value, in this case, the minimum cost that we have. So this allows us to compute also cost efficiency and economic measures of efficiency, where we actually take this distance to the technical efficiency, to the technical frontier as a technical efficiency measure, and this distance to the value or cost function as a measure of cost efficiency. So actually we can do this under DEA as well. I would say I would go quick here because I know that I'm already spending a lot of time. Basically, KPIs have several disadvantages. When we use these KPIs separately, they have a lot of assumptions that they assume, for example, constant returns to scale. KPIs provide a partial view of the whole, and they actually cannot consider these trade-offs between KPIs. That is when one increases, another decreases, or the fact that I don't have the ideal point, as I showed you in the previous graph, actually shows me that we have trade-offs between capital and labor. So I can have capital-intensive firms and labor-intensive firms. What happens is that frontier techniques actually can overcome these three disadvantages. And that is why they are useful to compute these aggregate indicators of performance, and they are useful to be used in complementarily to these KPIs, as we did in the websites that I just showed you. So as I was saying, the frontier techniques, they can mainly be used with two purposes. They can be used to aggregate a set of KPIs or to actually measure efficiency when these KPIs are divided into inputs and outputs. So when we pass from the idea of using this distance as an aggregation function for aggregating a set of KPIs, when we move from this notion to the notion of efficiency, we actually start looking at KPIs of two types. KPIs are divided into inputs and outputs. And so basically a KPI would be the output divided by the input, because KPIs usually are ratios, okay? So I don't have ratios anymore, or I can have, but that's a different story. So I don't have ratios anymore, and I have this division between inputs and outputs. And therefore, efficiency is actually a measure of the extent to which I can produce the maximum outputs from a given set of inputs, or the extent to which I can use minimum inputs to produce a certain value of outputs. Or I can actually have a mix of both. So basically, when we have this notion of efficiency, we usually have a sort of orientation. Am I oriented towards the maximization of outputs, or the minimization of inputs, or I want both at the same time. And we have measures of efficiency for both of these types. I'm going to move these on. We have another related concept with productivity, with efficiency, which is productivity. The concept of productivity is actually, productivity is simply the relationship between the outputs and the inputs used. And efficiency can be seen as a kind of relative productivity measure. I mean, productivity is not, to measure productivity, I don't need to be doing benchmarking, okay? But for doing efficiency, we need to benchmark, because we need to compare with the maximum output that can be produced or the minimum input that can be used. And therefore, under the concept of efficiency, I have the concept of benchmarking. For this concept of productivity, I don't necessarily have this notion of benchmarking implicit, okay? I can compute efficiency using LP models, in particular using a multiplier form or an envelopment form. It's very interesting, and this goes back to what I was saying before about the origins of these data envelopment analysis, because the origin is actually Farrell, 1957, and there are some authors that actually, there are previous publications to this one that already addressed efficiency. But Farrell can be considered the economic father of data development analysis. And Charles Yeo can be considered the kind of operational research fathers of this DEA technique. This is really interesting because the models, the model that Farrell looked at, it looks at efficiency using the notion of distance, efficiency as a distance from the frontier, while in the envelopment model, the notion is efficiency as a relative measure of productivity, where actually I have an aggregate of outputs divided by an aggregate of inputs. The aggregators here are the weights that I use to aggregate over outputs and inputs. And the fact that I'm obliging for all the other firms to have this productivity measure below 1 actually implies that I'm doing this benchmarking and comparing productivity with maximum productivity. It's interesting to notice that when Farrell developed this envelopment measure, he actually has a sentence in his paper where he actually disregards this multiplier version that was later on developed by Charles Yeo. He says that the unsatisfactory nature of productivity criterion led naturally to attempts to produce measures of efficiency that took account of all factors of production by adding up, in some sense, a firm's inputs of the different factors. They were naturally doomed to failure. One simply cannot add men and acres, pounds and horsepower without explicitly or implicitly pricing them. The difficulty is simply that of choosing a suitable set of prices as a basis for comparison. So basically it says that it's very difficult to actually add different units of measurement, because when we add these various outputs, they are in different units of measurement. When we add these various inputs, they are in the different units of measurement. What Charles Yeo find out is that they could find or let the LP model optimize these weights or these implicit prices to actually arrive at an efficiency measure. What happens is that these separate or different developments actually prove to be dual of each other. So actually this notion of efficiency as a relative measure of productivity and efficiency as a distance to the frontier they are dual concepts of each other. I think I am very short of time. I'm not going to tell you how many more slides I prepared, because I hope to have time to show you some developments on education that we did with some results from some papers, but I don't have time. So basically, what I would
can still proceed a bit. I mean, we are flexible.
Yes. Sorry, Paula. Okay, so I'm going to be quick here, because then if you want to leave some time for discussion, and then if you want, we can discuss this later on. So basically, I have done a lot of research in terms of education. So one of I'm going to show you two recent researches in education. One of them was done with Ana Camanho, which is here, or was at the beginning. I cannot see any people anymore. So, and we created a composite indicator, actually using 3 indicators for the success of students in higher education. And actually what we did was, this was one of the first studies that linked secondary school with higher education. So basically our idea was to try to compare schools on the extent to which they prepared students well for their higher education studies. So we looked at the first year scores of students. We looked at the ACTSs in this first year that students in higher school, in higher education did, and also the percentage of top students in a certain course in higher education. And we use these variables at the school level. So basically, we knew each school, for each school, how many students were on the top of their courses, how many ACTSs the students did from each school, and how many, what was the average of first year scores. This is an interesting data set because it's very difficult to actually get these data sets at a national level. What we did was we had for Porto University and Católica University, we actually had this matching data with higher education and the school of origin and also the entry grades. So this gave us a perspective, actually, which was very interesting, because we divided the schools into top, middle, and bottom schools in terms of our composite aggregator. This composite index that we had actually was a composite of these 3 variables that showed how schools performed in terms of the first year scores, the SETSs, and the percentage of students that they put on top. And actually we see that, well, top schools using our ranking, actually they had students doing many more ACTSs than bottom schools. They actually placed a lot of more students on the top of their university courses. And they also had, where is the other one? SETSs, and they have an average of first year scores that were much bigger than for the bottom schools. The interesting thing here is that regarding, for example, the average in terms of the national exams, the 3 types of schools, actually, they didn't differ. We did a Wilcoxon test, I think, or a Kruskal-Wallis test, and this didn't show any difference. So in fact, the students on entry were very similar in each of these schools, but then in university they performed very differently. So we also saw that they were not different in terms of this indicator of the ministry, which is the direct path of success and so on. So I don't have time to go into details here, but this study gave us a number of interesting results when we compared our composite index with the average, for example, in national exams, which is the criteria usually used to rank schools. And in fact, what happened is that we know that in terms of the average in national exams, public schools usually are on top of the rankings that are produced every year by the media in Portugal. But when we look at this composite indicator, which gives the success of these same students in higher education, what happened is that public schools perform much better in terms of this composite indicator. So actually what happens is that the private schools are better and they are very good at placing students in the university, but then while at university we have this phenomena here where public schools tend to actually provide better better students in a sense. I also did a very recent study. This is not published yet. This is work under progress where I was with a student. His work under progress. This is a publication, but it's a publication on in Portuguese in Cadernos de Economia. It's a very small summary. We used PISA for data for assessing and comparing schools from OECD countries. And in this particular case, we were looking at the phenomena of shadow schooling. We were actually looking at one particular variable. We were computing performance scores for students, for schools, but looking also at a particular variable, which is the percentage of students with additional instruction in math, science, and literacy, because PISA has this kind of data, and the percentage of students with this additional instruction, actually this is related with two things: with private tutoring, in some cases paid private tutoring, or schools that actually have extra classes for students that are in need of more contents, and so the schools have these extra hours of learning. We analyzed a lot of schools. I'm not have time to show you this. The interesting thing here is that actually we observed a negative relationship. And this is not with our composite index. This is something that we have, is a negative relationship that we observe between the additional instruction and the scores in PISA. And this negative relationship is very, very clear, both for mathematics or for science, for example, and we have the various countries here. There is only one country, which is Korea, which has actually very high number of additional instruction hours, and the enormous percentage of students with additional instruction, which is above 60%. This means that above 60% of students have additional instruction hours in Korea and performing very well in terms of the scores of PISA scores. All the others, there is this kind of negative relationship, which can be explained in several ways. If you want to discuss that, we can do that. And well, Paula, I think I'm going to skip the concluding remarks. It's just a summary of what I was saying. So I'm sorry that this took so long. I was not expecting that, sorry.